Greetings, chess players. My name is Chris Torres, and this is my daily chess musing for January 29th, 2021. I wanted to quickly review an instructional victory by Fabiano Caruana over Maxime Vachier-Lagrave from round 7 of the Tata Steel Masters played on January 23rd in Wijk. Fabiano's 14e6 is a subtle brilliance that permanently impairs MVL's ability to develop his pieces. Also noteworthy is Fabiano's endgame technique, in which he declines capturing on d6 and waits 6 more moves until the conditions are perfect to take the pawn. All in all, I found this game to be very educational, and I hope you do as well. So here we are, Fabiano Caruana versus Maxime Vachier-Lagrave from the 83rd Tata Steel Masters, played in Wijk in the Netherlands on January 23rd, 2021. Let's take a look. Fabiano starts with e4, and MVL plays c5, the Sicilian, knight f3, d6. Standard open Sicilian. Knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6. The Najdorf Sicilian is a specialty of Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Bishop g5, e6, f4, queen b6, queen d2, and queen takes b2. So we are in the famous poison pawn variation made famous by the likes of David Bronstein and Bobby Fischer. The b2 pawn is considered poison because after the queen captures it, black will lose time, material, or possibly even the game. However, if the player playing black has a lot of specialist knowledge, like MVL, on this variation, this capture is playable and of great theoretical interest. However, for most of us, it is better to refrain from capturing our opponent's queen's knight pawn with our queen. For more on why it's generally not a good idea to do this, see episode 1 of Chris Torres, with some help from my friends, which highlights this concept in the Tal Tringoff game. 9 rook to b1 obviously saves the rook and attacks black's queen. Queen a3, bishop e2. A most complicated line that has been a mainstay of high-level correspondence chess, but seen much less often in the over-the-board battles. 10 knight c6, 11 knight takes c6, bx c6, 12 e5, knight d5, knight takes d5, and 13 ex d5. It's a little strange that MVL didn't recapture toward the center with cx d5 instead. 14 e6, and Caruana immediately attempts to punish his opponent's questionable recapture. 14 f6, and now it definitely seems like black's last move was in fact a mistake. An alternative to 14 f6 is 14 fx e6, 15 castle, where white is already castled and unifies his rooks, and black isn't even close to doing either. Play could continue with queen c5 check, king h1, king f7, and 17 f5. Looks troubling for black, so I don't care for this variation. Another choice could be 14 bishop takes e6, 15 castle, bishop e7. Though still not a position I would like to play as black, this variation would be my preference. But Maxime Vachier-Lagrave played 14 f6, and Caruana follows that with 15 bishop h5 check, throwing a check to take away his opponent's ability to castle. 15 king to d8, and g6, blocking the check with 15 g6 is obviously bad because bishop takes f6, rook g8, rook b3, queen a4, and bishop g4. So black played 15 king to d8, 16 bishop h4, then d4. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave tries a nifty little trap. 17 bishop f2, but Caruana doesn't fall for it. Had Caruana played 17 queen takes d4, MVL would have had queen a5 check, and that's a nice big fork. But Caruana played 17 bishop f2, and then 17 queen c3. Now with his king permanently exposed, MVL decides to opt for an endgame. 18 f5. Caruana wisely defends his e6 pawn before the big trade. Queen takes d2, 19, king takes d2. And here it is very clear that something has gone terribly wrong for MVL. White has a passed pawn and a rook in an open file. Black's extra pawn is not enough compensation for his complete lack of development. MVL protects the d4 pawn. 20 bishop f3, rook a7, 21 g4, g6, and 22 bishop h4. Simple to spot and quite effective. 22 bishop e7, and to avoid that nasty fork, MVL's dark bishop has essentially become a pawn. 23 rook b6. Caruana keeps improving his pieces. 23 h5, 24 h3, king e8, 25 bishop g3, rook c7, 26 king d3. Good technique on display here by Caruana. By not taking the pawn on d6, Fabiano is limiting his opponent's chances of creating counterplay. For example, if 26 bishop takes d6 and bishop takes d6, rook takes, and then hxg4, hxg4, rook takes h1, 29 bishop takes h1, and black could end up with a rook in the open h file. So instead, Fabiano opted to slightly improve his king's position for the endgame. 26 hxg4. MVL tries to free up his position by exchanging. 27 hxg4. And Caruana is okay with exchanging rooks as long as black's other pieces remain blocked in. Rook takes h1, bishop takes h1, gx f5. So MVL's plan is to open up the king side and then continue with bishop f8 and rook to h7 to activate his pieces. 29 gx f5, bishop f8, 30 king c4. Kings are useful pieces in the endgame, and Caruana's king is much better placed than his opponent's. 30 rook h7, 31 bishop e4, saving the bishop. 31 bishop e7, 32 bishop takes d6. And now that Caruana's king is beautifully positioned, he takes the pawn on d6. Again, capturing on move 26 would have resulted in black freeing up his position before Caruana's king had advanced toward the action. By waiting 6 moves until the conditions for capturing improved, Fabiano Caruana puts on a master class in good endgame technique. 32 bishop takes d6, rook takes d6, 33 bishop b7. MVL unraveled the knot and finally gets his bishop into the game. Sadly, it's too late. Black is lost. 34 bishop takes b7, rook takes b7, 35 rook takes a6, rook b2. I'm sure Caruana does not mind losing the c2 pawn since he will be pocketing black's pawns on c5 and d4. 36 king takes c5, rook takes c2 check, king takes d4, and MVL resigns because white easily wins from here, with continued play looking something like 37 rook e2, then rook a8 check, king e7, rook a7 check, king d6, rook to d7 check, king c6, rook to f7, rook d2, king e4, rook takes a2, rook takes f6, rook e2 check, king f4, rook f2 check, king g3, rook f1, rook f7, rook g1 check, king f3, rook f1 check, king e2, and then the rook's got to get out of there, rook h1, pawn advances f6, rook to h5, pawn advances again e7, rook e5 check, king d3, king d7, rook f8, rook e1, and finally rook d8 check. And there's nothing black can do to stop white from promoting his e7 pawn into a queen on the next move. I recommend visiting TataSteelChess.com for more information, player interviews, and live broadcasts of this year's tournament. Also, be sure to check out the Daily Chess Musings Facebook page, follow me on Twitter at Tori's Chess, join our Daily Chess Musings Club on chess.com, and peruse through all of our free lessons at dailychessmusings.com. And with that, I bid you adieu. But before you go, please remember to hit the subscribe button.